Another critical person in contemporary theologies is Jurgen Moltmann. Some may call him Jurgen Moltmann. This gentleman comes up with theology of hope, and in turn, Jurgen Moltmann belongs in the ecclesial tradition of Reformed Presbyterians. Others of this tradition include Calvert, Brosk, Richard Nimba, Reinhold Nimba, Torres, and others. Born in Hamburg, Germany in 1926, Jurgen Moltmann is one of the most read, most relevant Christian theologians at work today. Born 1926, and this is 2020, he's still doing it and he's still strong. He comes close after Calvert, close second after Calvert, especially among Reformed theologians in the 20th century. This is attested by the fact that his works have been translated into 17 languages in the world. He has influenced the life of the church and its witness in the world throughout the centuries, not centuries, through a couple of decades. Moltmann was drafted into the German armed forces when he was barely 17 years, and that is during the Second World War that began in 1939 and ended in 1939 and ended in 1945. In this war, the Second World War, Jurgen Moltmann witnessed the war atrocities, the killings, the destruction of his hometown, the senseless waste of human life, and also the humiliation associated with the injustice that his country under Adolf Hitler had brought on the rest of the world. Consequently, he shared the guilt of being part of a nation that had set out to commit genocide against the Jewish people. Interestingly, this existential crisis brought him to experience the dawning of meaning and hope through faith in Jesus Christ. So the confusion he saw in the Second World War had a profound effect on his life. Nevertheless, this faith confronted Jurgen Moltmann with demanding questions. One question is, why had so many German churches and German Christians refused to join the confessing church in its opposition to the Adolf Hitler's regime and the Nazi ideology? The second question that confronted him is, why was the German church so reluctant to confess its guilt and to reform itself after the war? Now, Jurgen Moltmann is the father of theology of hope, and interestingly, he has a very realistic way of looking at theology and its task to society, and of course the world that God created. According to Jurgen Moltmann, Christian theology has the task of relating the Christian tradition and the message critically and therapeutically to this modern situation. In view of this, Moltmann is convinced that theology must be relevant as it addresses the problems of the church of its time and the situation of the people. To this end, it must be meaningfully communicated. It must be meaningfully communicated to the modern situation. In other words, you cannot use old ways to communicate theology of the 21st century in the way you communicated it in the 19th and earlier centuries. You have to adjust your language, you have to adjust the skills, the emerging issues, they have to be communicated relevantly. Accordingly, it must take responsibility for the present world and its future. This means that theology cannot bypass environmental crisis, quest for justice, human rights, anti-Semitism, sexism, racism, HIV and AIDS, coronavirus, among others. For this reason, Jurgen Moltmann holds that the pain and joy of faith must be celebrated in the areas of everyday life. Another point in Jurgen Moltmann's theology is that if faith is to be constructive to the world, it must address its problems. The world problems must be addressed by theology if it has to be relevant. If it ignores and says ours is heaven and we are not concerned about earthly affairs, then it will be relevant. And to ensure this, it must not simply repeat the solutions of the past. In carrying out its constructive tasks, the church must believe in the risen Christ, who inspires its new ideas through his resurrection. Another point in the task of theology, according to Jurgen Moltmann, is that the path of theological knowledge runs irreversibly from the particular to the general, from the historic to the eschatological and universal. That appears in his theology of hope. The starting point for his theology of hope is the story of Jesus Christ, viewed from the perspective of the cross as the intensification of Jesus' life. For in God raising Jesus from the dead, God opened up a new future. Another point in the task of theology, in Moltmann's view, is that the present must be interpreted in the light of the future of the crucified Christ. To this end, theology must be therapeutically ministered to the needs of the people and must also be critical and prophetic, unmasking and denouncing those aspects of life that are not in tandem or in harmony with the peace of God, the shalom of God. The theologian thus is concerned with the transformation in expectation of a divine transformation. Another point is in his works is that knowledge and verification of God's truth must be understood in terms of orthopraxy rather than orthodoxy. Of course, to this end, the believers must allow God to determine their whole life. Interestingly, Moltmann reshapes the famous theological dictums, Fideos, Querens, Intellectum. Those are Latin ones. In that theology of hope that I will explain. By this issue of trying to say that theology is for intellectuals only, this shift in Moltmann in trying to revise those dictums is that reason is no longer used to justify how things are. You cannot just say it's just reason. Rather, reason becomes a servant of the Christian hope that is fueled by faith in the ultimate triumph of the crucified Christ. And in turn, this conviction informs and motivates the believer to anticipate that triumph by following Jesus Christ here and brought about the triumph of the crucified Christ. The oppressor will not triumph over an innocent victim. In other words, when we look at the triumph of Christ, the victory of Christ upon crucifixion, that is in Jurgen Moltmann's implies that it symbolizes the victory against evil in the world, the oppressor versus the oppressed. And so the oppressor will overcome. So the oppressed will overcome the oppression by the oppressor. Now, in theology of hope, where I want to conclude on, Jurgen Moltmann dwelt heavily upon the Bible to formulate his concept of eschatological hope. That is future. Eschatology is all about the future. So in that eschatological hope for the future, he saw the Bible as a very critical book. As Martin Luther, the reformer of the 16th century, held with the justification, Moltmann found the Bible brimful of the idea of the future hope. He noted that God of the Bible has future as his essential nature, and therefore God is one who is always honorary before us, who encounters us in his promises for the future. So for Jurgen Moltmann, God is future, God is hope, and we must cling to this hope. This futuristic theology is divided into two aspects. One, hope, the other one is future. In regard to hope, Jurgen Moltmann held that Christianity is eschatology, or is futuristic, and it's hope, and it is forward looking and forward moving, and therefore Christianity is a revolutionizing and transforming the present. The work of Christianity and Christian theology is to transform and to revolutionize the future. In regard to the promise, he saw it as a side of the eschatological coin. And he says, a promise is a declaration which announces the coming of a reality that does not yet exist. To him, this concept of the promise is clearly seen in the Old Testament. For him, the church participates in the uniting of men with one another, in the uniting of society with nature, and in the uniting of creation with God. In short, it is the participation in the history of God's dealings with the world, and as he noted, the God of the Bible has future as his essential nature, and therefore one who is always honorary before us, who encounters us in his promises for the future. Thank you very much.